So I finished watching season 1 of Fallout, and I have quite a few thoughts I want to share about it. And based off many of the reactions I've been seeing online, I think I have a bit of a different reception compared to a lot of the Fallout fans out there. But also importantly, this video won't be getting into any major spoilers for the TV show. If you want to go in completely blind, this is probably a good one to avoid, because I will talk about some things on a very high level, but I won't be spoiling any major plot points, although get subscribed, because I am going to be doing a spoiler discussion video in a couple of days. So overall, I thought the Fallout TV show was really good, but for Fallout fans specifically, I think this one was fantastic. And while I do think it's just good TV for audiences in general, I think when it comes to Fallout fans, the Fallout TV show is a must-watch. The single most impressive part of the show overall to me was how accurately it portrayed the vibe of the Fallout games. Like yeah, getting the props and so much of the setting right was also incredibly impressive, but the intangible feel of the game was also really captured by the show, which was incredibly enjoyable for me to watch. And scene after scene, things looked right, they sounded right, but they also felt right, which is, I think, a major reason as to why the show is being so widely praised by fans of the franchise. Fallout's actually pretty odd. It's a unique blend of wacky humor, harsh realities, all in this post-apocalyptic backdrop with its own unique set of ideals. But the show does a really great job at representing that. Despite the fact that there is an irradiated wasteland as the backdrop for much of the show, most of the most horrific scenes aren't wasteland specific and are just actions being committed by humans. That felt so very Fallout, and as much praise as the prop and set departments deserve for their beautiful vaults, weapons, and more, the writers definitely deserve massive praise because it feels like they actually understood why people love Fallout with this show. Although when it does come to the props and sets, they of course did a phenomenal job here as well. I feel like we could even just tell this from many of the trailers, and I'm really happy some of the older games got recognition also. The show overall definitely was inspired by the aesthetic of Fallout 4, but the references to some of the older games made those games feel recognized, which I think went a long way for a lot of fans. But even more specific stuff like Operation Anchorage being a surprisingly large plot point. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of newer fans didn't even realize this was all a reference. But do get subscribed because I am going to be pointing out a ton of references in a future video. The show's overall production was top tier, although objectively you could tell some of the CGI wasn't quite perfect. For whatever reason, as I was actually watching, this never took me out of an episode. The Fall TV show was a big budget production, but that was actually felt as you were watching this one. So often they take us to a new place or landscape, and I was completely immersed in everything that was going on, and all of it was incredibly accurate. And considering the fact that they managed to capture the feel of Fallout so well, it's likely no surprise that my favorite parts of the Fallout TV show were a lot of the new stuff. Like yeah, we got to see a vault, which is really cool and exciting. I love getting to see a vault, but many of the new ideas or the expansions they made onto some of the existing lore was incredibly fascinating to me, and I love many of the directions they took. This of course is probably the hardest aspect of the show to cover without spoilers, and expect a lot more discussion on this in my spoiler talk, but between vault content to even pre-war content to just general wasteland content, I really enjoyed almost every time we saw something new. The show explores one's own identity as a vault dweller, what is important to those people, and how does the rest of the wasteland feel about vault dwellers. We've seen that somewhat in the games, but it's greatly expanded here. And many of my favorite individual scenes in the Fallout TV show are pre-war, and it's incredible insight into the world of Fallout. How a society on the verge of collapse is reacting and planning and even confronting that question of what is truly most important to you. The pre-war stuff was good enough that I think this could justify its own TV show. Give me Vault Tech, the Enclave, and Cooper Howard all in a corporate drama leading up to the bombs dropping. But down the waist, the Fallout TV show still felt very alive. I think the show does a really good job at portraying the collapse of society, and actually does even a better job compared to some of the games with showing people struggling. And while so much of the show was just a visual pleasure, and I really enjoyed many of the new things they attempted, I did still have some issues with the overall season 1 writing. There were definitely some major high points, but also some low points for me. I think they did manage to strike a really nice balance of not boring existing fans while introducing the world of Fallout to many of the new viewers out there, but the fact that they formatted the first season so similarly to how many players play the games wasn't a positive at all for me, and honestly it was one of my biggest negatives. The Fallout TV show is incredibly simple, at least until the final episode. They do this thing where they introduce a decent amount of curiosity and intrigue in some of the early episodes. They give our main character this major motivation to venture out into a terrifying wasteland. A gigantic move for somebody who is otherwise just a sheltered vault dweller, but then they kind of just ignore that motivation for the rest of the show up until you get to the point where it matters again. A lot of the curiosity that's introduced in the earlier episodes doesn't come up again until the end of the show, and it's really just in the finale. It is a perfect recreation of how many of us play the Fallout games. You get the main story right at the start, you get that motivation, then you basically just fuck off to do side quests for 8 to 80 hours. Before eventually returning to that main story. But in a TV show format, I found this bad, and there's several points in the middle of this show where I was genuinely bored with what was going on screen. The middle of the Fallout TV show really feels like a sitcom to me, where the characters are just interacting with and dealing with whatever is immediately in front of them. The show has some larger mysteries and cool ideas that it likes to play with. I just wish they played with that a bit more in the middle, make my brain work a little on some of those inter-episodes. And I think I know why this bothered me. It's not that the show needs to be complicated to be good. Simple shows can still be incredibly enjoyable, but early on they introduced some really compelling mysteries, stuff that I wanted to think about, that I wanted to get to the bottom of, and I hoped that would be explored on screen. But in reality, it kind of feels like they just cut to the ending. They cut out the whole middle speculative part. They show you that curious thing, then the next time you see it, you're getting the full explanation on what that curious thing is. There's never really points in the middle where you're left to wonder or speculate or get a clue as to what's going on there. A rather large chunk of the middle of the Fallout TV show was just aimless wandering around the wasteland. And this definitely isn't saying the show is bad in the middle, it's more saying that I think it would have been elevated by playing with more of the complicated ideas while also showcasing the wasteland misadventures. Because those wasteland misadventures are still a ton of fun, it's still incredibly interesting and oftentimes funny to see what your major characters are getting up to, but it does all kind of feel a bit pointless. Although, I think Amazon Prime did a phenomenal job at hiding this. The decision to release all episodes at once enabled binging, and I think really helped the overall perception of the show. If we had weekly releases, I think some of those 35-minute middle episodes would feel a lot worse and be getting a lot more flack. But alternatively, you just watch 35 minutes and immediately flow into the next episode, and it's really not that big of a deal. And I actually really enjoyed binging this show. I'm typically more of a week-to-week speculate in the middle type of guy, but this one I sat down to watch one episode and I'd very quickly end up watching several all at once because the flow is so well done with these. And thankfully, when you do eventually get to the conclusion, they tie all of this together super well. So many of the cool ideas they came up with have very satisfying conclusions or even just explanations in the show. And they do a great job at introducing a lot of curious or interesting things and then answering many of them, but also leaving a few open-ended. By the end, they definitely set up some of this stuff for a season 2, and I actually really like that. It feels like we're going to have a great time speculating about which direction they could take things in going forward. And this definitely doesn't apply to all of the plot lines in the show. Plenty do get attention throughout the show overall, as we basically will revisit those. Every time a vault was on screen, I was having a very good time. And I think the way the TV show handles some of these secondary plot lines and mysteries involved with those was almost perfect. I was intrigued, speculating, and constantly wondering what would happen next with certain things. I just wish that also applied to the main storyline. But even still, the adventures of Lucy, Maximus, and the Ghoul are incredibly entertaining. Watching them get up to their random wasteland misadventures was almost always a really fun time, even if oftentimes what they were doing was actually quite simple. Like, yeah, even though you probably know what's going to happen at the end of going into the Super Duper Mart, it's still a lot of fun to watch them go through that process and see what kind of weird things they get up to in the middle. And I think a really big part of this is the TV show does a really great job at making you care about the three major characters very early on. Each of these three characters is incredibly distinct. They all have their own ideals, their ways of dealing with this new world, but relatively quickly you get to see how they handle something. Whether this be a strong character struggling and feeling weak in a moment, or even a weak character finally getting power for the first time and how they handle that, or even just what happens when a character fails and how they react to that failure. For those of you who have watched the TV show, even though I'm sure all of us have a favorite character out of the three, I was very quickly able to sympathize with the other two options, which is really just phenomenal writing. Unfortunately, at least for me, the phenomenal writing didn't extend to all three major characters throughout the entire show. I really enjoyed the stories of both the Ghoul and Lucy. Lucy has a fairly familiar evolution, what you'd expect of a vault dweller going out into a wasteland while also being naive, but I really like how they handle things with the Ghoul. cool. You have this weird dichotomy where he is, not necessarily the best dude as he's adventuring around in the wasteland. You could see this even from some of the release trailers. But then he has a bunch of pre-war scenes, and you get to see this other side of him when he was just Cooper Howard. And it really is this cool and unique dichotomy that they've already explored with Westworld, where you get to see two versions of the same character, and it makes you care a lot more about the later version, even if the later version in his own right doesn't necessarily have as much depth. And yeah, how they handled this, and especially how they handled some of the scenes coming up to the ending with these characters, was just phenomenally well done. Sadly, Maximus kind of sucks. I thought Maximus's character was kind of strange and at points just flat out bad. I understand what they were going for. Maximus's background and how he was raised has major implications on who he is, which really is true for almost all of us. But I think the execution of who Maximus is at certain points in the TV show was just kind of weird. He very rapidly goes from this gunslinging badass in the wasteland to just not, and almost the polar opposite of that. And again, I understand the why, I understand why he's acting in some of those ways, but I just kind of wish they chose a different direction. Honestly, I think Aaron Moten, the person who plays Maximus, had some of the best acting out of all of the characters in this show, but I think the writing was really letting his character down at a lot of moments here. Hopefully, as we get into season 2, we see much more evolution and growth from this character, and then I honestly think he could be my favorite out of the show overall. There's so much potential for what they could do with this guy, it just feels like they really let us down with season 1. Thankfully, both the Ghoul and Lucy were exceptional all throughout season 1, and I loved their characters. And one thing I will say is, I feel like we got a nice amount of screen time for all of the major characters. I feel like I got to know each of them. I got to see moments where they had opportunities to grow. And by the end, I didn't really feel disappointed or like I was missing anything. The end of season 1 left me wondering where these characters will go in the future and excited to see their future, which I think is just good writing, even if some of the specific moments I wasn't a huge fan of. But speaking of things I am not a fan of, what to me was one of the most genuinely disappointing parts of the Fallout TV show was none other than the score. And this is totally my own fault. Ramin Djawadi did the score for Fallout Season 1. He also did the scores for stuff like Game of Thrones or Westworld. I love this man's music. Like, I would almost say this man's music is a core part of my identity as a human. The vast majority of my videos are edited while listening to his music. It got me through college. So when I heard he was doing the score for Fallout, I dropped to my knees in a Wendy's. Then I heard it. The score for Season 1 of Fallout is boring and forgettable. I have very little desire to listen to this again, with the one and very large exception being the Brotherhood of Steel track. That was awesome, and I love that one. I'll definitely continue listening to it and add it to my playlist. But so often, while watching the series, the music would kick in and do absolutely nothing for me, or even worse, immediately take me out of the scene because the tracks are almost identical to what they had in the later seasons of Westworld, and even some of the transitions are almost the same as the later seasons of Westworld. This is very likely a niche issue because most of you probably didn't watch the later seasons of Westworld, but I did. I am a gigantic Westworld fan, and there are quite a few scenes in Fallout that are literally just the same thing they did in Westworld with the music choice and transitions. And while I did find the score overall to be pretty lackluster and boring, there was one gigantic outlier. I thought the scenes where they did use the Fallout theme music from some of the various games were incredible. I was absolutely blown away from these scenes. It was not only the scenes they chose to use this in, like the moments they chose for it, but also how they mixed it in. I really felt like a master class on how to make a fan base very happy. So with that in mind, I absolutely loved the Fallout TV show. This is one of those series that I think is a must-watch for fans, but also just a great watch for anyone out there. For me, the TV show is definitely not the pinnacle of television that many others are describing it as, but I still had an incredibly good time, and I love a lot of what they did with this one. Honestly, some of my favorite parts were some of the new ideas they were exploring. It's almost weird in that I feel like some of the hardest parts they got perfect, while some of the easier, or what seemed like easier parts, they kind of fumbled the bag with a little bit. And it definitely is one of those shows where it's not even that I'm just hungry for a season 2, because yes, I am, but I even go a step further and I hope they start making spin-off shows because I just want more Fallout in my life. While watching this TV show, it felt like I was watching something from somebody who genuinely understood why so many people love Fallout. And I am incredibly excited to see where they go next with this one. But you're also probably wondering where you go next. You likely just binged the first season, and now maybe you want to play some Fallout 4. Well, check out this video for some of the best mods to download right now for a new playthrough of the game.